Why are you overstaying when you know it's time to go? There are two big mistakes that folks make. You leave too soon. You overstay your welcome. Are you jumping before you've done the exploration? We forget who we are. You've lost yourself. My body told me, you're done. Get the f- out of there. Like you can live a better life than sticking with the devil you know. I'm just saying. Chapters end all the time. It's part of life. Hello and welcome to the Unlock Lab. I'm your host, Tosca DiMatteo. I'm so glad you're here. Look, if you're new here, then welcome. I help leaders to get out of their own way of success. I help you get to the deeper layer of what's getting in your own way. If you want to learn more about the work I do, please visit CoachTosca.com. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is when to stay and when to leave your leadership role. And there are two big mistakes that folks make along the way. One is that you leave too soon. And the second is that you overstay your welcome. Now, there's a whole big continuum on this, right? You could overstay by 6 months or overstay by 6 years, right? And as I'm getting into this topic, I want you to think about your patterns and where you might reside on this continuum, because usually there's a pattern. So I know folks who have stayed long stints and it was clearly overstaying. And I'm not talking about just your actual career either. Like this conversation will focus on the environment at work, but this applies to relationships. It applies to situations. It applies everywhere. And you'll know also if you're the kind of person who leaves too quickly. So maybe you've had a string of stints of a year or 2 years or 6 months. And this is an indication of what your pattern is. And hopefully this conversation will help you identify if there's something that will benefit you in shifting that pattern. Because I'm not saying it's all bad to do these short stints or all bad to do long stints. What matters is that you're paying attention to why you're leaving, when you're leaving. Okay, so let's start with the first scenario, right? Which is that you leave too soon. This can happen when you think everyone else is the problem, when everything is wrong in the company, nobody knows how to do their job, right? But you haven't actually looked at yourself in the equation. Because yes, of course, like there might be some major issues and concerns and some difficult players in your workplaces, but have you looked at how you're showing up and what your role in that equation has been, or how that's been impacting your mood and therefore how you're showing up? So for example, if you show up every day and you're in resentment or in low-key resentment, or if you're overgiving and you feel like you're not being appreciated, that is going to impact the energy in the room. It's going to impact how you show up. So the point being that if you don't pay attention to what you're feeling, what's triggering you in that role, then what you're doing is you're just deciding to run before you do that inner work on yourself and say, hold on, what if I shift something in me and see what happens? I mean, to be honest, when I'm coaching leaders, this is so much of the work that I'm doing, which is helping them to show up in the best version of themselves. And that usually shifts the outcomes from previous experiences or past experience, right? This might be the reason why you can't find contentment, no matter the role or the company, because you keep finding everything that's wrong with the situation versus looking at, hey, what is working? How can I shift my expectations perhaps? And how can I find the generosity? How can I find the abundance? How can I find the opportunity with where I am? Because trust me, once you start flipping that lens that you're looking through, everything can change. And look, if it doesn't, that's a whole nother story. Then that means, hey, yeah, what's the exit plan? But what happens is that because the vast majority of leaders aren't doing the inner work of saying, like, what do I have to clear? What do I have to heal? What do I have to accept? That's what leads to this, constant search for the next thing because nothing seems to be working out. Now, of course, this does not apply to workplaces that are damaging emotionally and all of that, right? Like, it doesn't apply if you've tried a number of things, if you've, worked on yourself. I'm talking to you about this if you just haven't done any introspection on yourself and how you're playing a role in your own misery in your experience in your role. And look I'm not pointing the finger. I have been there myself, for years and years. When I was in corporate, I felt unfulfilled in my roles. And I changed bosses, I changed companies, I got promoted. And yeah, the workplaces may not have been ideal for me, but I was the only constant in the equation. Yeah, sure, I had challenging bosses and tough situations, but what was happening was I wasn't finding fulfillment because I was relying on external validation and I was setting unrealistic expectations for myself. And I carried proving energy around with me. And it wasn't until I addressed this that I could find ease in my heart and in my career. It wasn't anything that anybody else was doing. I had to look at myself and say, why can't I find peace and fulfillment here? Why can't I find acceptance in what is and just enjoy what is? Because the truth was that I did enjoy the work. I did enjoy the people. I enjoyed the challenges, but I was letting everything else get in the way of how I showed up. And once I could shift that, everything changed. So I want you to consider if you are currently in a situation or you've been in situations where you just wanted to jump ship. What did you do before you decided to leave? Did you have a deep conversation with yourself? Did you ask yourself if there's a different way to look at things? Did you look at the baggage that you were carrying from previous jobs into that one? Did you let yourself get overwhelmed and frustrated by the uncertainty? Like, all of this is going to impact whether there was opportunity for you there to dive a little deeper and start to find more ease within yourself and see how that could shift your experience and the environment, quite frankly, because that's how powerful you are. That as a single person, you can not only shift your internal world, but that translates into shifting the external environment as well. Because when you show up differently, other people will respond differently and they will show up differently as well. So this is a big one. Are you jumping before you've done the exploration? Is there anything else that you can control, that you can do to shift your experience? Because if you have, that's another story. But if you haven't and you decide to leave, the challenge is you are going to continue that pattern probably in the next place and the next place and the next place until you do that work. So there's that. And by the way, if you are in a role and you're not sure, like, am I leaving too soon? Reach out to me. Let's have a conversation. I'm happy to do that. You can look at my contact information in the show notes on this platform for sure. Okay. So let's get to the next piece. And the next piece, I think, can actually do a lot more damage. So the second piece, and the second big mistake that leaders make in terms of managing their career, is overstaying. I think overstaying, when it's expired, your time there has expired, can really impact your confidence and your motivation. And there's some really negative consequences beyond that, which is health. That's a huge consequence and a huge indicator of if you've overstayed or are currently in a situation where you're overstaying. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why this can happen. Overstaying is common because of a fear and scarcity mindset. And especially when the economy is challenged, and especially, right, with job contraction, you can get stuck in asking yourself, well, can I find something that pays as much and How long will it take? That's a huge watch out. Because if you're operating from that scarcity mentality and that's what's keeping you where you are when it's actually expired and you're already in a situation overstaying, then you are going to be walking an uphill battle to get motivated every day and all of those things. So that scarcity mentality, you got to watch out for it. When you know it's time to go, when you're like, this chapter is over, but you're staying because, fill in the blank, that is a big watch out because that means you're not honoring your intuition. You're not trusting that when something is over, and then you're staying and you're going to go deeper and deeper into a hole, whether that's a hole of like your own despair, you're spiraling down of confidence or, anything of that nature, right? Or even just prohibiting yourself from experiencing more growth, personally and professionally. Those are the consequences. Overstaying also happens because it can feel like a lot of effort and therefore you just have inertia about taking steps. Some people overstay because they feel like they're aging out. I think that's just that's hugely driven by scarcity and limiting beliefs. And I'm not saying that there's not kernels of truth, but it's not the truth. The truth is if you have a desire and you have a goal, there are opportunities for you. Not every door is going to be closed because you've hit some certain age. No, I don't believe it. It's not freaking true. Okay. Another reason why people overstay is frankly, they are comfortable with the devil they know. And I get it, right? You're like, well, is it going to be better? Is the grass really greener somewhere else? Or should I just stay here because I know how to deal with it? I think you can live a better life. I think you can expect more and ask for more out of life than sticking with the devil I'm just saying. I think the other reason why people overstay is because they continue to trying to fix where they currently are. And what that does is mean you're focusing more on your present than you are on your future. And that creates this constant spool of staying because you're still trying to make it work where you are when the truth is it's really not working. It's not going to work. It's because that deep down inside, but you just don't want to give up. And trust me, that has been me to a T in several of the roles that I've been in. So, this is not about shaming yourself. This is not about judgment. This is just about awareness of what's really going on. Why are you overstaying when you know it's time to go? And sometimes being able to label and name like, oh, this is what's happening. This is why deep down I'm not taking those micro steps to make the change. That can really be eye-opening. And it might lead to you making a different choice or having a different thought or belief about what's possible. And, frankly, kind of like this idea of, the devil that is the idea like you might like being the expert. So you might know that like you're not being challenged anymore. You're not growing. You're not really enjoying it. You're like, watching the clock, but you like being an expert that feels comfortable, that feels safe. And so you don't want to leave. And I get it. Not everybody has a growth mindset. Not everybody, is at a stage in your career where you're looking to grow and you're looking to, add new experiences and new learnings and new skill sets. But if you are a leader, then those are things that, should be part of your cycle. Sure, it's okay to stay in places where you're like, yeah, things are humming and I'm an expert here and I'm doing great work and I'm having impact and I'm feeling good. But if that's not the story and you're really deep down just staying because you like the comfort, you can do this stuff in your sleep, then my perspective is if you're not moving along, then you're preventing somebody else from stepping into that and being in a role that is best suited for them. And this can be folks in roles, where maybe it's even time for retirement. Maybe it's time to find something else that you're interested in. Maybe you've got the money. Maybe you've got the stash of cash, but you're still hanging on to the power, that you feel when you're in your job and you've overstayed. I'm just being honest. This happens. And maybe it's not you, but maybe it's somebody that you know, right? And it's like, yeah, why won't they leave? Because they're maybe hooked on the validation of having that title and having that job, but really they've overstayed because maybe the organization needs a new kind of expert, a new kind of leader, a new way of thinking, which happens when somebody's been in a role for a really long time, right? Sometimes you just need new blood, new juice. So, okay. I think you get the sense here of why do people overstay? Why might you be overstaying? And that's a good exercise to deep dive on. You can hit pause right now and do some journaling yourself, or you can keep going with me and come back to that. Okay. So here's the thing. People ask me, well, how do I know if I'm overstaying? Right. And it's a great question because maybe it's murky. Maybe there's things you love. Maybe there's things you hate. Maybe you've done a bunch of work on yourself. Maybe you've done that deep dive exploration. Maybe you haven't, but how do you know? And I think this can kind of look like kind of death by a thousand cuts. Like it could just be adding up over time versus be one big thing, where I gotta go. And frankly, in my career past, like when I've changed jobs, it has been this major thing that I got really frustrated by. And then I was like, oh, I gotta go. But the truth was I had overstayed by that stage anyway. It was just finally something happened. Like the universe, made something happen so glaring that I was like, okay, I gotta get out of here. Like I'll give you like a really early example. So I was in a role that I knew I wasn't going to be in for very long because I had plans to move to a different city. And I was there and I was just kind of like waiting to see what was going to make sense for when it made sense to leave. But the truth was like that my boyfriend, now husband at the time, was living afar, and we had a long distance relationship for over a couple of years. And like I probably, right, if I was operating in my power, should have said, you know what? This is exactly how long I'm willing to be long distance before it's going to be too hard on us. And I should have had that goalpost in mind. But I didn't do it that way. I waited until finally something happened and I felt disrespected. And I was like, and I got to go. But in hindsight, I think that was the universe's way of saying, like, go be with your boyfriend, like, go move on with your life, because that's the life you want to build, not the life, in this location that you knew was temporary. So that's just an example of, sometimes it's a thousand cuts. Sometimes it's something big happens, but usually it's little things that build over time, and you don't realize, like, oh my gosh, there's all these indications that it's time for me to go. Something that can happen, again, these small cuts along the way, your boss changed over and over and over again, and you keep having to reprove yourself and you feel like you want some stability. And so that constant change kind of like was eating away at you and causing resentment, and maybe you recognize what you actually want now is something a little bit more stable, something a little bit more calming to your nervous system. Another example of how you can kind of get these little cuts is like you've been disrespected, but you ignore it and hope that other person will change. But then, another thing happens and you feel disrespected, and another thing, and you keep, thinking it's going to change and it's not. And all of a sudden you've been in a role for, 18 months and you felt disrespected from the beginning, and it's eaten away at your confidence and all that stuff. But it's just these little things that happen that show you that maybe this isn't the place where you're going to feel valued. Another example is you may realize over time that you joined thinking that you had aligned values with the organization or with your boss, but then you realize eventually there was a misalignment. And then eventually it becomes a gaping hole that makes you feel very uncomfortable. And because things can happen slowly over time, you may not recognize it as, oh my gosh, my values aren't aligned anymore. And maybe you've been thinking, oh, this is my fault. And it's not. It's just, you're growing one way, the company's growing another, and all of a sudden it's a mismatch. And so sometimes you can overstay without realizing it was a mismatch a long time ago. Another thing that can happen is your responsibilities can shift, and that means that now you don't feel satisfied because you're being asked to do something that you actually don't like, or it doesn't fulfill you, or, it's boring to you, or it's not challenging, whatever the thing is. And maybe what you do is say, well, I'm just going to suck it up. This is what I have to do. Or, I shouldn't complain. I should be grateful. I have a job and I'm privileged, and this type of thinking diminishes the truth of what you actually want. Yes, you can be appreciative, and yes, you can feel like, grateful, and you can also want more out of your career, and that's okay. Another one that I kind of touched on, but I really want to highlight here is that maybe over time you have just not felt supported by leadership, but you continue to want to get them to like you and appreciate you. And you keep thinking you can win them over with your sheer will and your sheer niceness and bending over to give them what you think that they want. And you can end up doing this for a long time. I have done that for a long time, right? Where I'm just like, but wait, if they really, saw what I was capable of, they would be a fan and they would be an advocate. And sometimes it's just not a fit, and we think we can shift that, but it takes two to tango. You might be shifting some things, but if the other person isn't shifting or they're not seeing your shifts, right, then you're going to be a mismatch, and you're never going to, you shouldn't have to win anybody over. You shouldn't have to, mold yourself to such an extent that you don't even recognize yourself anymore. And I know that that's what happens when we overstay. We shift and we mold and we try to be who we think they want us to be. And then all of a sudden we forget who we are. And that's a huge indication that you've overstayed, because you've lost yourself, because you felt like you had to do that to survive and thrive. And let me tell you, you don't. You don't have to live that way. There is a place for you and there is a space for you in this world, because you are here right now, and your desires are going to match somebody else's needs. And the longer you stay somewhere where you're not aligned to someone else's needs and appreciation for you, the longer you're delaying enjoying this one life you have to live. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but I will say that a huge sign of overstaying will happen with the body. And we want to ignore our bodies, and we want to pretend shit's not happening, or we want to be in denial, or we want to, minimize it. But your body can be the biggest indicator that it's time to go. And that's definitely happened to me in my career, where my body told me, girl, you're done. Get the fuck out of there. And by that, I mean, butterflies in the stomach when you wake up in the morning and you're dreading looking at your email. Like if you've literally had to go to the hospital, maybe you have high blood pressure, maybe you're having panic attacks, maybe you're getting migraines. Like it can show up a number of different ways. It can show up tightness in your chest, tightness everywhere, your body. And I'm talking about these prolonged experiences, right? Not like one day you had butterflies in your stomach, you were worried about a meeting. I'm talking about like weeks on end, months on end, your body is telling you something is not working anymore. And you keep thinking you can, talk yourself out of it, or you keep thinking you can figure it out. There's nothing to figure out. You just have to accept like, hey, this chapter is over. That's okay. You don't need to be hard on yourself. Chapters end all the time. It's part of life. Trees die, flowers die, they regrow, you replant, all the things. I think sometimes we think that things are supposed to last forever, or we have this hope. Okay, this job, I'm going to be at this job for X many years. And you set this expectation and you go in there and you say, oh, this doesn't work. Well, why should you sit there and make it work for 5 years if you realize it wasn't a fit? Like we have to really look at, it's okay for chapters to end before we thought they would. And again, this is not just about jobs. It's also about relationships. The natural cycle of life is life, death, rebirth, and it happens in our careers as well. And I think it's just one of these things we don't talk about very much. But that if we can fall into acceptance of these cycles, then hopefully you'll beat yourself up less when it's time to move on, even before you were ready or before you wanted to. I cannot iterate enough that when it comes to overstaying, there are so many people that overstay for a variety of reasons. I am certainly one of them. I have had to break that cycle in my life in every way, in relationships, in romantic relationships, in employment, in friendships. It runs the gambit, and I think part of it is because I've done this work, I've gotten better at recognizing the signs, right? I've gotten better at paying attention to my body. I've gotten better at trusting my intuition and even being able to sense my intuition versus what my brain was trying to convince me of. And let me tell you, the other side of that, the other side of breaking out of these patterns, whether it's, you're staying too long or you're leaving too soon, when you break the patterns that aren't serving you, what happens is you allow for what's meant for you to come forward, and it happens much sooner, right? Because once we can acknowledge what's not for us, then we can start to make space for what is for us. So even if it's in the case of you leave too quickly, then when you make space to look at yourself, you make space for people to see you in a new way, to see you differently as well. You make space to see other people differently, and you make space for something new to come to fruition. And maybe that something new is a different opportunity, but your work was to do that inner work before a bigger opportunity came along. Sometimes that's the way that life works. And as a leader, when you manage other people, part of your job is to help other people see when they might be falling into one of these extremes and helping them see what's possible if they address those patterns. So this conversation isn't just for you. It's for the people that you lead, so that you're guiding them to follow their best and highest path, because that's what you want for yourself and that's what you want for them. If in a case, let's just say, for example, high performers, right? Like at some point, you're going to have to let them go because it's in their best interest to move on and to be challenged in a bigger way. And it would be selfish for you to encourage them to stay when you know that if they stayed, they would be overstaying and be hurting themselves as a result. So I hope this gave you some things to think about from a number of different lenses, because this is a huge opportunity for you to get to that next level of leadership by understanding your own patterns as it relates to, am I leaving too soon or am I overstaying in the roles that I'm saying yes to? And if you want to continue this conversation, by all means, put it in the comments on this platform. Reach out to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this or your confessions. Like sometimes, it's just helpful to say, oh man, yes, I do this thing. And just to say it out loud. You could say it to me. You could say it to a friend. You could say it to somebody that you trust and say, oh my gosh, I realized I listened to this episode and I have this pattern and I need to shift that, start somewhere, start with a micro acknowledgement, a micro insight that you have. And by the way, if you had an insight, please do me a huge favor and rate, review, subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening on, because that will help bring awareness to other people about this topic so that maybe they don't overstay or leave too soon as well. See, it helps you. Help me help you. But yeah, I appreciate your support. I'm so glad that you're here, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Unlock Lab. Ciao for now.